I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've always tried to be the good son. You know, the one who shows up to family events, helps out when things get rough, and keeps the peace even when it's awkward. But recently, things took a weird turn that I wasn't expecting. Now, my parents, who I've never had a terrible relationship with, are threatening to sue me for emotional damages. Yeah, you heard that right. Sue me. It all started a few months ago, when my sister, who we'll call Jess, came to me with a very urgent request. She's 24, and on paper, she has everything. Pretty good job, a shiny new car, and a perfectly fine apartment in the city. But she'd gotten herself into a little financial bind by buying a house she couldn't afford. To make things worse, she hadn't been upfront about it until the payments started piling up. And that's when she came to me for help. You see, Jess and I don't have the best relationship. It's not that I hate her, far from it, but let's just say, she's the type to expect things without offering much in return. Growing up, she always had this golden child vibe. I'd work hard for everything, and she'd somehow float by on charm and the occasional wink. My parents, not wanting to rock the boat, always seemed to encourage this, probably because they saw how charming she could be. So when Jess asked me for help, it was one of those moments where I felt like I couldn't say no, even though deep down, I knew it wasn't a good idea. She explained that she was in over her head, falling behind on her mortgage payments, and she needed a little financial breathing room. You might think, hey, family's family, right? Help her out. But the thing is, Jess never takes responsibility for anything. I've been burned before with her asking for favors, only for her to forget about them as soon as things go well for her. She wasn't really sorry for the mess she was in, she just didn't want to deal with the consequences. So I did what I thought was best, I said no. And that's when things got complicated. My parents flipped. Like, completely lost their minds. I wasn't just refusing to help, I was apparently abandoning my sister and being selfish when she needed me the most. Their words were harsh, you don't care about family, you're heartless, you owe it to her. The guilt trip came hard and fast. But despite all that, I stood my ground. I didn't have the money to bail her out, and I couldn't just keep putting myself at risk every time she dug herself into a financial hole. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. Now, I've gotten some strange letters before, bills, junk mail, even a couple of overdue notices. But this one? It was different. It was from a lawyer. I thought it was a joke at first, honestly. But then I read it, and I realized my parents were serious. They were threatening to sue me for emotional damages. I stood there, staring at the letter in disbelief. Emotional damages? From not paying my sister's mortgage? It was absurd. I mean, I knew my family could be dramatic, but this was next-level stuff. And yet, there it was in black and white, my parents were really going to take legal action against me for not giving my sister money she didn't deserve. At first, I thought maybe I misread something. Maybe this was a misunderstanding, or maybe they were just trying to get under my skin. But the more I read the letter, the more it sank in. This wasn't a joke. They were asking for a substantial amount of money, plus emotional damages for the mental anguish my refusal had caused Jess. And then the worst part? They were accusing me of being unsupportive, of not valuing family. It's like I was suddenly the villain in a story I never asked to be in. I'll admit, I was rattled at first. The idea of my parents, the people who raised me, wanting to take legal action against me over a situation they didn't fully understand felt like a punch to the gut. They had never been this extreme before. They were the ones who always taught me to resolve issues with conversation, to be calm and rational, to find common ground. But here they were, not trying to talk it out, but ready to fight me in court. As if that wasn't enough, Jess was all over social media, posting about how devastated she was by my behavior. I couldn't even scroll through Instagram without seeing a new post about how family should never turn their back on you, and how some people just don't understand the meaning of unconditional love. The pressure was mounting. My parents were digging their heels in, and Jess, well, she was playing the victim card like a pro. And here I am, stuck in the middle of it all, trying to figure out if I'm really the bad guy in this situation or if I'm just being dragged into something that was never my problem in the first place. What do you think? Would you help out, even if it means risking everything you've worked for? Or would you stand your ground like I did? Things got ugly real quick after I refused to help my sister with her mortgage. And when I say ugly, I mean a whole different level of ugly that I didn't even know was possible within a family. It was one thing when my parents first called me selfish and heartless. That was expected, honestly. My mom, in particular, could lay on the guilt like a pro, and I heard those kinds of accusations before. But when they actually got a lawyer involved, that was a game changer. It wasn't like I didn't try to explain myself. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I just couldn't swing it. I had my own bills to pay. My rent. My savings for the future. I wasn't rolling in money, and even if I wasn't about to be the safety net for every financial mess Jess got herself into. But that didn't matter. At least, that's how they made me feel. I'll never forget the day my dad showed up at my apartment with that look in his eyes. He didn't even knock, just walked right in like he owned the place. I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to work on some freelance stuff when I saw him standing there. "Son," he said, his voice low and tight, "this has gone on long enough." I hadn't heard from him in days, but now here he was, acting like nothing had happened. As if I wasn't about to be dragged into court by my own family. "I'm not paying her mortgage, Dad," I said, trying to keep calm. "You know that." "I've already said no." He didn't even blink. "You owe her this. You owe your sister, and you owe your family." The way he said it, like it was some kind of moral duty, made me feel like I was the villain in a soap opera. He went on about family being everything and how I was the one ruining things. But it was the next part that threw me off. "We've already contacted a lawyer," he said, like it was just another thing to check off a to-do list. "They'll be sending you a letter. You'll understand when you see it. You'll regret this, son. Trust me." And then he left. Just like that. I was left standing there, completely blindsided, with a sinking feeling in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation over and over in my head, wondering if I could have handled it differently. Maybe I should have softened my response. Maybe I could have offered her something, even if it wasn't money. But no! I stood my ground. And it wasn't about the money at this point. It was about principle. It was about me saying, enough. But my parents weren't letting it go. They wanted me to pay up. And if I didn't? Well, according to them, I was going to face the consequences. And those consequences came quickly. I got a letter, just like my dad had warned me. The words legal action were right there on the first line, and I felt my stomach drop as I read through the contents of the letter. The lawyer's letter was full of legal jargon, but the message was clear: if I didn't come through for Jess, they'd take me to court. Emotional damages. They were claiming that my refusal had caused mental suffering to both Jess and my parents. And there it was, in black and white, this whole mess was spiraling out of control, and I was the one in the middle of it. What got to me the most, though, wasn't the letter itself, it was the fact that my parents were willing to go this far. They were willing to tear apart our family's reputation just to force me into helping her out. It wasn't even about whether I could or couldn't afford to help anymore. It was about their manipulation, the way they expected me to fall in line and do what they wanted. And then came the real gut punch, my sister, Jess. She wasn't backing down either. It wasn't like she was upset or remorseful. No, she was playing it like a game. She'd reached out to me a few times, leaving messages that sounded more like ultimatums than anything else. "You're really going to let Mom and Dad go through with this, huh? Or I never thought you'd be the one to break the family." It felt like a punch in the gut each time I read one of her texts. Like she was trying to guilt me into submission, as if somehow I owed her this. The worst part was when she posted a video on her Instagram. There she was, sitting in her cozy living room with a glass of wine, talking about how devastated she was that her own brother was letting her go bankrupt. The caption? "When family turns its back on you." I sat there, staring at the screen, completely floored. I thought, really? This was the woman who spent money like it was burning a hole in her pocket, and now she was playing the martyr? I couldn't believe it. But now, with the threat of legal action looming, I had a decision to make. I could cave, pay up, and salvage some semblance of peace. Or I could stand my ground and risk destroying the fragile relationship I had left with my family. What choice was I supposed to make here? Was I just being stubborn, or was I right to refuse to take on this responsibility? The days after the lawyer's letter hit felt like I was living in some bad soap opera. I kept expecting some dramatic music to start playing every time I walked through the door. The tension with my family was thicker than I'd ever thought possible. Every time I picked up the phone or even checked my email, I braced myself for more of the threats. But nothing prepared me for what was coming next. My parents' lawyer sent a follow-up letter, more aggressive this time, demanding that I pay the amount they claimed I owed for emotional distress. The letter was filled with all these legal terms I barely understood, things like compensatory damages, mental suffering, and breach of familial duty. But the bottom line was clear: if I didn't fork over the money, they were moving forward with the lawsuit. I sat there reading the letter over and over again, my head spinning. Was this really happening? Was I actually going to get sued by my own family? The words "family" is everything echoed in my mind, the same words they always used when it was time to make me feel guilty. But now, here they were, trying to drag me through the mud just because I said no. I tried calling them, both my parents and Jess, but every time I picked up the phone, I just couldn't do it. I had no idea what to say. The situation was already so messed up that there were no right words left. I didn't want to cut ties with my family. I really didn't. But this felt like something I couldn't back down from. If I gave in now, I'd just be setting myself up for more of this in the future. If I gave them money, what would stop them from asking for more? Where did it end? One afternoon, I ran into a friend of mine, Marco, at the coffee shop. I hadn't seen him in a while, so we sat down for a quick chat. I was still stewing over everything, trying to wrap my head around how I ended up in this situation, when Marco asked, "So, how's the family doing?" The question hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd barely even thought about it, until right then. I felt my stomach tighten. Not great," I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. "Actually, it's a mess." He raised an eyebrow, sensing that something wasn't right. "What happened?" I took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to even begin explaining it. And then, for the first time, I spilled everything. I told him about Jess asking for money. I told him about how my parents flipped when I said no. I even told him about the lawsuit. The words came rushing out, faster than I could control, like I had been holding them back for too long. Marco was quiet for a moment. He looked at me, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "Man, that's messed up," he said. I laughed bitterly. "You think?" I didn't even know this kind of stuff happened in families. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "It's like they think you owe her. But the thing is, they're wrong. You don't. No one is entitled to your money. Not even family. That hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because Marco was right. I'd spent so much time second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too harsh or too stubborn. But hearing someone outside of my family confirm what I was feeling made the whole thing a little clearer. This wasn't just about money, it was about boundaries. And, more than that, it was about respect. "Thanks," I muttered. I needed to hear that. But even with Marco's words hanging in my mind, things didn't get easier. If anything, they got worse. The next few days were a blur. I avoided calls from my parents, but they kept sending texts, all of them sounding more desperate and accusing with every new one. It was like they were trying to force me into a corner, playing every emotional card they had left. Then came the real kicker. Jess posted another video. I saw it pop up on my feed one night while I was scrolling through Instagram, not expecting anything more than the usual memes and random updates. But there she was, sitting in her now dominant family's falling apart position, with a sad face and her arms crossed. This time, she didn't just play the victim, she went all in. She talked about how she had no choice but to let go of everything, including her home, because of my cold-hearted decision. "I guess some people just aren't cut out for family," she said, staring into the camera like it was some dramatic scene from a movie. "I wish I could have had a brother who cared, you know?" I stared at the screen for a while, unsure of what to feel. Was this really happening? She was now publicly shaming me, as if I was the one who had wronged her. I wanted to call her out, to say something, anything. But I knew it would only fuel the fire. I couldn't help but feel this gnawing sense of frustration that kept building and building. My sister, my parents, they didn't see it. They didn't see that I had limits. That I had my own life to live, my own responsibilities. It was clear now that they were pushing me hard. They weren't just testing my boundaries, they were trying to break me down. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my mom called. I didn't pick up the first time. But then she texted me, "Call me now. We need to talk." I knew it was bad. I could feel the pressure rising in my chest as I tapped the number to call her back. The moment she picked up, I could tell she was already upset, her voice tight with that familiar edge. "Why are you doing this, son?" she asked, and I could feel the accusation in her tone. "Why are you being so stubborn? Don't you care about your family?" I couldn't take it anymore. I snapped, "I do care about you guys. But this isn't about caring. This is about me setting a limit. I'm not your ATM. I'm not here to fix everyone's problems." There was silence on the other end. For a long, awful moment, I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But I didn't back down. The day the court summons came, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss. It wasn't even the court date that shook me, it was everything that led up to it. Every call, every text, every angry word from my parents and Jess just piled up, suffocating me until I couldn't breathe. I had spent weeks wrestling with myself, trying to figure out whether I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I knew. I had to stick to my guns. I couldn't let them push me around, not anymore. Still, when I saw the envelope with the official seal on it, I couldn't help but feel that all too familiar tightness in my chest. It was like everything that had been building for weeks was finally about to explode, and there was no stopping it. I sat on my couch, staring at the letter. The words blurred a bit, but I knew what it said. The lawsuit was officially going through. They were coming for me, coming for my money, my peace of mind, and my future. And somehow, that felt like a betrayal, like they were willing to throw away everything over something so small. It was just a mortgage payment. Why couldn't they just handle it themselves? I decided I couldn't just sit back and let this happen without doing something. So, I picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and dialed the number for the lawyer listed on the papers. The call rang twice before someone picked up, and I almost hung up right then and there, but I stayed on the line. "This is Henry Walker's office," a stern voice answered. I'm calling about the case," I said, my voice a little shaky, but determined. "I need to speak to the lawyer handling the lawsuit against me." The person on the other end hesitated, probably deciding if they wanted to deal with this idiot who was questioning the system. But then they said, "I'll connect you." A few seconds later, I heard the lawyer's voice. He introduced himself like he was some big deal, and I immediately felt like I was out of my depth. "Mister, your name, I assume you've received the papers?" he asked. His tone was smooth, professional, but there was a cold edge to it. Like he was already imagining the money in his bank account. "I've gotten them," I said, my voice tight. "And I need to know exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish with this." "I mean, suing me for emotional damages over this? Your parents feel that your refusal to help your sister has caused them unnecessary emotional suffering," he said, his words carefully measured. "They believe this situation has deeply affected their mental well-being. And, as a result, we are seeking financial compensation." I let the words sink in for a moment. Emotional suffering. Financial compensation. All because I told my sister I wasn't paying her mortgage. The absurdity of it hit me like a slap to the face. "I'm not going to give in," I said, feeling more solid with each word. "I'm not going to pay. You can't force me to do that." The lawyer's tone shifted ever so slightly. "Well, mister, your name, we'll see you in court then. We have all the necessary documentation, and we're confident our case will succeed." I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking, but I was finally ready. I wasn't going to be intimidated anymore. The next few days were a blur. I spent hours talking to legal advisors, trying to figure out what my options were. They explained that it was highly unlikely I would actually have to pay the damages they were asking for. But the stress, the anxiety, it was real. The idea of having to go to court, of my parents testifying against me, of the whole world knowing that my own family was suing me, it was unbearable. That's when things took a turn. Jess called me, and I could tell she wasn't calling to apologize. Her tone was all high-pitched and frantic, like she was caught in some whirlwind she couldn't control. "Are you seriously going to let this happen?" she snapped, before I even had a chance to say anything. "You've ruined everything. You're letting Mom and Dad go through with it, and now we're all going to lose." I stayed silent for a few moments, letting her words wash over me. I didn't want to lash out. I didn't want to lose control. But my heart was pounding, and all I could think about was how easily she was playing the victim, how quickly she was pointing fingers, and how little responsibility she was taking. "I'm not the one who put us in this position, Jess," I said, trying to keep calm. "I'm not the one who mismanaged their finances and then asked everyone else to bail them out. This isn't my mess to clean up." The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the phone, and I knew this wasn't just a normal conversation anymore. This was the turning point. "You really don't care, do you?" she said softly, her voice cracking just a little. It was the first time she sounded anything but entitled. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize how far things had gone. But then she recovered, like nothing had happened, and in her usual tone, she said, "Well, if you're going to do this, just know this, you've lost me." That hit harder than I expected. Losing Jess wasn't something I wanted, but at that moment, I realized something. I had already lost her. The person who had taken advantage of me over and over again, the one who used family as a shield to cover up her mistakes, wasn't the person I thought I knew. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't need her approval to live my life. And with that, the floodgates opened. I finally felt the weight of everything I had been carrying slip off my shoulders. I wasn't fighting for approval anymore. I was fighting for my own peace of mind. The court date was creeping closer, and I felt like I was living in a constant state of unease. I could barely focus on anything else. Every conversation, every interaction, seemed to circle back to this ridiculous lawsuit. Even my friends started asking me how things were going, and I'd shrug, trying to downplay it, but inside I was falling apart. I knew what was at stake. My family was falling apart right before my eyes, and no matter how much I tried to block it out, it wasn't going away. But the more I sat with it, the clearer it became. I had to stand my ground. I couldn't keep being the person who got walked all over. And I couldn't let them destroy everything just to save face over a few $1,000s. One night, a few days before the court date, I was sitting in my apartment, alone, as usual, when I got a text from my dad. It was simple, but it hit me hard. He asked if we could talk. Now, I'll be honest, the last thing I wanted to do was talk to him. The idea of having another emotional conversation felt like too much to bear. But I also knew that this might be the last shot to actually fix anything. So, I replied, "Sure, when?" And within minutes, I got a call. "Son," my dad said, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to resolve this before it goes any further." I didn't even know where to start. Part of me wanted to just go off on him, to say everything that had been bottled up for weeks. But instead, I just asked the one question that had been gnawing at me. "Why, Dad? Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to sue me over something so stupid?" There was a long pause on the other end. And then he sighed, like the weight of everything finally hit him. "It's not stupid, son. It's family. We're supposed to help each other out, especially when someone's struggling." I felt this strange mix of anger and sadness wash over me. "But that's just it, Dad. Jess isn't asking for help because she's struggling. She's asking because she messed up and doesn't want to face the consequences. That's not how family works. Family doesn't just bail you out every time you fail." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. But then, to my surprise, he spoke again. "I know, son. You're right." His voice was a little softer now, almost regretful. I've been so caught up in trying to keep everything together that I didn't realize what it was doing to you." At that moment, I felt this small sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this conversation could actually go somewhere. "I love your sister," he continued, "but I know I haven't been fair to you. And I know we've put you in a position where you feel like you're being taken advantage of. That's not right." I blinked hard, trying to process what he was saying. Was this really happening? Was my dad actually admitting that he'd been wrong? "I'm sorry, son," he said, his voice cracking a little. "I don't want to lose you over this. I've been putting too much pressure on you, and it's not fair." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. It was like a weight was being lifted off my chest, but I couldn't quite believe it. I didn't know if this was enough to fix everything, but it was the first step. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like I might not have to choose between my family and my own peace of mind. "I don't want to lose you either, Dad," I finally said, my voice low. "But I need you to understand that I'm not the one who's wrong here. I've made my decision. I'm not going to be part of this lawsuit. And I'm not going to help Jess bail herself out anymore." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end, like he was trying to decide what to say next. And then, almost reluctantly, he said, "I understand. But, we're not going to drag this out anymore, son. We're going to drop the lawsuit." I couldn't believe it. After everything, after all the threats and the tension, it was really over. They were going to drop it. My heart started beating a little faster, a mix of relief and exhaustion flooding my body. "Thank you," I whispered, even though it felt like the smallest step in a much bigger journey. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a while, letting it all sink in. Was it really over? Had my parents really seen the error of their ways? Part of me wanted to run over and hug them, to tell them everything would be okay. But another part of me knew that this was just the beginning. This wasn't some magic fix. We still had a long way to go to rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The next few days went by in a blur. I hadn't heard from Jess, and frankly, I didn't expect to. But then, on the morning of the court date, I got a call. It was from her. "Hey," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "I heard about what happened with Mom and Dad. I just want to say, I get it. I messed up. I'm sorry for everything." I sat there, stunned. Was this really happening? Was Jess apologizing? "Thanks," I said, struggling to find the words. "I just want to move on. I want us all to move on." She didn't say much after that, but the phone call was enough. Maybe this was the start of something new. Maybe it wasn't too late for our family to rebuild, piece by piece. As for me, I'd learned something. I'd learned that sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that shape who you are. And standing up for myself, even against my own family, was the best thing I could have done. It wasn't easy. But in the end, I realized that I was worth more than any mortgage payment, any lawsuit, or any amount of guilt they tried to throw at me. I was finally free.